Some stories become so famous that they almost stop feeling real. The sinking of the Titanic is one of them. Over the past century, countless books, documentaries, films, and articles have explored every detail of that tragic night. We know there are already many incredible documentaries on this topic, just as there are for many of the historical events we cover on this channel. So why are we telling this story again? Because at the Retro Review, our goal is not simply to repeat history. Our goal is to revisit the events that changed the world, present them as accurately and objectively as possible, and invite you to become part of the conversation. We don't decide who was right or wrong. We don't tell you what to believe. Instead, we explore the evidence, the people, the decisions, and the consequences, then leave the final judgment to you. As you watch this documentary, ask yourself, was the Titanic truly doomed by an iceberg alone? Or did human confidence, outdated regulations, class divisions, and a series of avoidable decisions sink the ship long before it struck the ice? Stay with us until the very end, because we'd genuinely love to hear your thoughts. Tell us what you think happened, what lessons this tragedy still teaches us today, and if there's another historical event or historical figure you'd like us to cover, leave your suggestion in the comments. Your idea could become our next documentary. This is the story of the ship that was believed to be unsinkable. This is the sinking of the Titanic on the night of April 14th, 1912, in the freezing black waters of the North Atlantic. The largest and most celebrated ship ever built slipped beneath the surface in under 3 hours, taking with it more than 1,500 lives. The Titanic was supposed to be the safest ship in the world. It was supposed to be unsinkable. This is the story of how that promise collapsed, hour by hour, decision by decision, and the people, famous and forgotten, who lived and died because of it. The story begins not with the ship itself, but with a rivalry. In the early years of the 20th century, two shipping companies, the British White Star Line and the Cunard Line, were locked in fierce competition for dominance of the transatlantic passenger trade. Cunard had recently launched two extraordinary ships, the Lusitania and the Mauretania, both celebrated for their speed. White Star Line, led by its chairman J. Bruce Ismay, decided not to compete on speed at all, but on size, luxury, and stability. Working with the Harland and Wolff shipyard in Belfast, and its chief designer Thomas Andrews, White Star planned a trio of ships that would dwarf anything else on the ocean: the Olympic, the Titanic, and the Britannic. Titanic was to be the second of these giants, and the grandest. Construction of the Titanic began in March 1909 and took over 2 years, employing roughly 3,000 workers at the Belfast shipyard. When completed, she measured more than 880 feet long, weighed over 46,000 tons, and stood as tall as an 11-story building from her keel to the top of her funnels. She had 9 decks, 4 massive smokestacks, though only 3 were functional, and interiors designed to rival the finest hotels in Europe: ornate staircases, Turkish baths, a swimming pool, a gymnasium, and dining rooms decorated in period styles from Louis XVI to Jacobean. Titanic was, in essence, a floating monument to the wealth and confidence of the Edwardian era. The claim that Titanic was unsinkable did not come from an official company slogan, exactly as popular memory often repeats it, but it grew from real engineering features that gave contemporaries enormous confidence. The ship was divided into 16 watertight compartments, sealed off from one another by doors that could be closed from the bridge in the event of flooding. Trade publications of the time wrote that even if 4 of these compartments flooded simultaneously, an extremely unlikely scenario in the minds of the ship's builders, Titanic would still stay afloat. This confidence, magnified and repeated in newspapers, hardened into a kind of public mythology. Titanic was safe. Titanic could not sink. It was a belief that would prove fatally influential in the decisions made in her final hours, and fatally absent from the number of lifeboats she carried. Titanic departed Southampton, England, on April 10th, 1912, on her maiden voyage to New York City, under the command of Captain Edward Smith, a veteran White Star Line officer nearing the end of a long and respected career, planning this crossing as his last before retirement. The ship made the brief stops in Cherbourg, France, and Queenstown, Ireland, picking up additional passengers before setting out across the open Atlantic on April 11th. On board were an estimated 2,224 people, passengers and crew combined, though exact figures have long been disputed by historians due to incomplete and inconsistent record-keeping at the time. The passengers aboard Titanic represented a striking cross-section and a striking division of Edwardian society. In first class traveled some of the wealthiest people in the world, including American businessman John Jacob Astor IV, one of the richest men on earth, traveling with his young pregnant wife Madeline. Also aboard was Isidor Straus, co-owner of Macy's department store, traveling with his wife Ida, who would famously refuse to leave her husband's side even when offered a place in a lifeboat. Benjamin Guggenheim, of the wealthy Guggenheim family, was also among the first-class passengers. These individuals occupied lavish suites, some with their own promenade decks, and dined in a first-class restaurant offering multi-course meals with fine wine. In stark contrast, third class, often called steerage, carried hundreds of emigrants, many of them Irish, Scandinavian, and Eastern European families seeking a new life in America, traveling in far more modest functional quarters below decks. Between these extremes sat second class, comfortable but unpretentious, filled largely with professionals, clergy, and tourists. This class division was not merely social. It would prove to have a direct and brutal bearing on who survived the disaster and who did not, since access to the boat deck, where lifeboats were located, was more difficult and more delayed for those traveling in third class, whether by ship design, crew decisions, or the sheer physical layout of the vessel. Also critical to this story were the men who crewed and commanded the ship. Captain Edward Smith held ultimate responsibility for the vessel. First Officer William Murdoch was on watch in the critical moments of the disaster. Second Officer Charles Lightoller would become one of the most consequential figures in the aftermath, overseeing lifeboat loading on the port side with a strict and, in retrospect, needlessly rigid interpretation of women and children first, that left some boats leaving with empty seats. And in the crow's nest, that fateful night stood lookouts. Frederick Fleet and Reginald Lee, the two men whose eyes would be the first to see the iceberg, hampered that night by the fact that the ship's binoculars for the lookout post had been misplaced before departure, locked in a cabin whose key had gone missing with a crew member reassigned before the voyage began. Throughout the day of April 14th, Titanic's wireless operators, Jack Phillips and Harold Bride, received a series of ice warnings from other ships in the area, reporting icebergs and field ice along Titanic's course. Several of these warnings were relayed to the bridge, but the ship's wireless system that day was also being used heavily for a far more mundane purpose, transmitting personal messages for wealthy first-class passengers eager to send word to friends and family, a lucrative service for the Marconi company that operated the wireless equipment. At least one critical ice warning from the nearby ship Californian was never delivered to the bridge at all, cut off by Phillips, who was busy working through a backlog of passenger telegrams, and told the Californian's operator, in a widely quoted exchange, to keep out, as he was already busy. Titanic continued to steam through the night at a speed of roughly 22 knots, near her maximum, through a region known to contain ice. A decision consistent with common practice of the era, but one that left dangerously little margin for error. At approximately 11:40 p.m. on April 14th, lookout Frederick Fleet spotted a dark shape looming out of the night ahead of the ship. He rang the crow's nest bell 3 times, the signal for danger ahead, and telephoned the bridge with the now infamous words, "Iceberg right ahead." First Officer Murdoch, on duty at the time, ordered the ship's engines reversed, and the wheel turned hard to attempt to steer around the obstacle. For 37 agonizing seconds, the ship attempted to avoid collision. It was not enough. The iceberg scraped along the starboard side of the hull, below the waterline, out of sight of most aboard, who felt only a faint shudder, so mild that many passengers did not even wake, and some who did assume nothing more than a minor mechanical issue. The true damage was catastrophic and largely invisible from the deck. The iceberg's impact did not tear one massive gash into the hull, as popular imagination often assumes, but instead buckled the steel plating and popped rivets along a series of separate punctures spanning roughly 300 feet, across 6 of the ship's 16 watertight compartments. This was the critical, fatal detail. Titanic's design could survive flooding in up to 4 compartments and remain afloat. 6 compartments flooding simultaneously exceeded that margin entirely. Thomas Andrews, the ship's chief designer, who was aboard for the maiden voyage, was summoned to inspect the damage alongside Captain Smith in the earliest minutes after the collision. Andrews performed rapid calculations and delivered a verdict that stunned the captain. The ship, he said, was doomed and would likely have no more than about 2 hours before sinking entirely. What followed was a race against time, complicated by insufficient equipment, poor planning, and a fatal lag between the severity of the crisis and the crew and passengers' understanding of it. Titanic carried only 20 lifeboats, enough for approximately 1,178 people, roughly half of those aboard that night, despite technically exceeding the outdated maritime safety regulations of the era, regulations that had never been updated to reflect ships of Titanic's enormous size. This shortfall, born largely of that unsinkable confidence that had shaped the ship's design philosophy, would prove to be one of the single greatest contributing factors to the enormous loss of life. Captain Smith gave the order to begin loading lifeboats and to wake passengers shortly after midnight. But confusion reigned in the ship's first response. Many passengers, especially those in first and second class, woken from sleep, did not initially grasp the severity of the situation, and some were reluctant to leave the warmth and apparent safety of the enormous ship for small open boats bobbing in the freezing dark ocean. The first lifeboat launched, boat number 7, left with only about 28 people aboard a boat rated to carry 65. a pattern of significantly underfilled lifeboats that would repeat throughout the early loading process as officers, uncertain of the lifeboat's true load capacity and fearing the davits might fail under full weight, erred toward caution rather than capacity. Second Officer Charles Lightoller, overseeing loading on the port side, enforced an especially strict interpretation of women and children first, in several cases refusing to allow men into boats even when there was room remaining, and lowering boats only partially filled, rather than wait to see if more women or children would arrive. On the starboard side, First Officer Murdoch applied a somewhat looser standard, allowing men to board in the relative absence of women and children nearby, meaning survival rates would later differ noticeably between the two sides of the ship, a stark and largely accidental consequence of which officer happened to be loading which boat. Third-class passengers, meanwhile, faced significant additional obstacles reaching the boat deck at all. The ship's layout, designed in keeping with the immigration regulations and class separation conventions of the era, placed barriers and gates between the lower decks, where third-class cabins were located, and the upper decks where lifeboats waited, ostensibly for health inspection purposes related to immigration law. In the chaos and confusion of the sinking, many of these barriers were not opened promptly, and some crew members were reportedly slow or reluctant to guide third-class passengers upward, whether due to language barriers since many third-class passengers spoke little English, unclear ship layout knowledge, or simple prioritization of the wealthier passengers above. The resulting survival rate for third-class passengers would prove dramatically lower than for those in first and second class. The ship's band, led by violinist and bandmaster Wallace Hartley, gathered on the deck and continued playing music as the crisis unfolded, a now legendary act of composure intended to calm frightened passengers amid the mounting panic. All 8 members of the band would ultimately go down with the ship, playing, according to numerous survivor accounts, until close to the very end. As the night wore on, the ship's forward decks sank increasingly lower into the water, and the true scale of the disaster became impossible to ignore. Distress rockets were fired into the sky at intervals, a desperate visual signal to any ship that might be near enough to see. Wireless operators Phillips and Bride continued transmitting distress calls using both the older CQD signal and the newer SOS designation, one of the first widespread uses of that now universal distress call, reaching out into the dark for any vessel that might respond in time. Tragically, a ship was near enough to potentially help. The SS Californian sat stopped in ice fields only some miles away that night, close enough that crew members on both ships reported seeing each other's lights. But the Californian's wireless operator had gone off duty for the night, shortly before Titanic's distress calls began, and crew members on the Californian who observed distress rockets in the distance debated their meaning without waking their captain with sufficient urgency. A tragic and much scrutinized failure of communication and judgment that has been debated by historians and maritime investigators for over a century since. The ship that did respond and arrived in time to rescue survivors was the RMS Carpathia, under Captain Arthur Rostron, roughly 58 miles away when Titanic's distress call reached her. Rostron immediately turned his ship toward Titanic's position and pushed the Carpathia to speeds beyond her normal safe operation, navigating through the same dangerous ice field, arriving at the scene at around 4 a.m., just under 2 hours after Titanic had gone under, in time to begin pulling survivors from lifeboats scattered across the freezing water. Titanic's final moments. In the roughly 2 hours and 40 minutes between collision and sinking, grew steadily more desperate as it became clear There were not nearly enough lifeboat seats for everyone aboard. As the bow sank deeper, the ship's stern rose increasingly out of the water, and passengers and crew still aboard scrambled toward the rising stern in a desperate, chaotic bid to delay the moment of submersion. Around 2:18 a.m., witnesses reported the ship's lights flickering and then failing entirely, plunging the scene into darkness broken only by starlight and the flames of lifeboats' lanterns. Shortly after, the ship's structure, under enormous and unequal stress, is widely believed to have broken apart between the third and fourth funnels, the stern briefly settling back before rising again and finally slipping beneath the surface at approximately 2:20 a.m. More than 1,500 people were left in or thrown into water, measured at around 28 degrees Fahrenheit, several degrees below the normal freezing point of fresh water due to its salinity, cold enough to induce fatal hypothermia within minutes. The screams of those in the water, described by numerous survivors in the lifeboats as one of the most haunting aspects of that night, gradually faded as the cold overwhelmed one victim after another. Very few of the lifeboats, many of them launched under capacity, and now with room to spare, returned to attempt rescues from among those struggling in the water, out of fear among some occupants that a rush of freezing panicked swimmers might capsize the boats entirely, a decision that has remained a difficult and painful subject in survivor accounts and later historical judgment ever since. When the Carpathia completed her rescue operation that morning, she had recovered approximately 705 survivors from the lifeboats. Of the estimated 2,224 people who had been aboard Titanic, more than 1,500 lost their lives, making it, at the time, one of the deadliest peacetime maritime disasters in history. Survival rates varied dramatically by class and by gender, with first-class women surviving at a rate near 97%. While third-class men survived at a rate below 16%. Numbers that starkly illustrate how deeply the era's social hierarchies shaped who lived and who did not that night. Among the notable deaths were John Jacob Astor IV, who helped his pregnant wife Madeline into a lifeboat, but was refused a seat himself and died in the sinking, his body later recovered from the water. Isidor Straus refused a seat offered due to his age, and his wife Ida, in turn, refused to leave him, reportedly telling a crew member that she had lived with her husband for many years and would not leave him now, the two remaining together to the end. Benjamin Guggenheim, according to survivor accounts, changed into formal evening dress as the ship went down, reportedly stating that he and his valet were prepared to go down as gentlemen. Ship designer Thomas Andrews, having accepted from early in the crisis that the vessel he had built could not be saved, was last reportedly seen alone in the first-class smoking room, staring at a painting, having apparently made no attempt to save himself. Captain Edward Smith went down with his ship, as tradition of the sea and his own sense of duty demanded, his final movements in the last minutes never fully confirmed by surviving witnesses. Not everyone aboard behaved with such stoic sacrifice, and the aftermath of the disaster included significant controversy and scrutiny of certain individuals' conduct. J. Bruce Ismay, chairman of the White Star Line, survived by boarding one of the last lifeboats to leave the ship, a decision that provoked enormous public criticism and accusations of cowardice in the press, particularly in the United States, and that haunted Ismay for the rest of his life, effectively ending his prominent public standing despite his role in building the great ship in the first place. In the weeks that followed, formal inquiries were launched on both sides of the Atlantic. A United States Senate investigation led by Senator William Alden Smith and a British Board of Trade inquiry in London. These investigations examined the insufficient lifeboat provisions, the ice warnings that went unheeded, the ship's excessive speed through dangerous waters, the conduct of the Californian and its failure to respond to visible distress signals, and the broader question of maritime safety regulation. The findings led directly to sweeping changes in international maritime law, including the establishment, in 1914, of the International Convention for the Safety of Life at Sea, which mandated that ships carry lifeboat capacity sufficient for everyone aboard, established 24-hour wireless radio watch requirements, and created the International Ice Patrol to monitor iceberg locations in the North Atlantic shipping lanes, an organization that continues its work to this day. For decades after the sinking, the wreck of the Titanic lay undiscovered on the ocean floor, roughly 12,500 feet below the surface, its exact location unknown despite periodic search efforts. It was not until September 1st, 1985, that a joint American and French expedition led by oceanographer Robert Ballard finally located the wreck, split into two main sections, bow and stern, resting more than half a mile apart on the seabed, along with a vast debris field scattered between them, offering the first physical confirmation of many long debated details about how the ship had broken apart and sunk. The story of the Titanic has endured for more than a century, not simply as a maritime disaster, but as a kind of cultural parable about hubris, class, technology, and the illusion of human mastery over nature. It has been the subject of countless books, documentaries, and films, most famously the 1997 film that introduced the disaster to an entirely new generation. But behind the myths, the legends, and the dramatizations lies a very real night, on very real, freezing water, where the fates of over 2,000 people were shaped by a collision of engineering limitations, human error, class inequality, and simple devastating chance. The unsinkable ship sank in under 3 hours, and the people who lived through it, and the many more who did not, left behind a story that continues to be told, examined, and remembered more than 100 years later. More than a century has passed since the Titanic disappeared beneath the freezing waters of the North Atlantic. The ocean has reclaimed the ship, but it has never erased its story. The sinking of the Titanic was more than a maritime disaster. It was a tragedy shaped by ambition, engineering limits, outdated safety regulations, social inequality, and a chain of human decisions that, taken together, changed thousands of lives forever. The disaster also transformed the future of sea travel. New international safety laws were introduced, lifeboat requirements were rewritten, continuous radio watches became mandatory, and the International Ice Patrol began protecting ships from the very dangers that claimed the Titanic. Here at the Retro Review, we believe history is more than a collection of dates and facts. Every event has different perspectives, unanswered questions, and lessons that still matter today. So now we'd like to ask you, in your opinion, what was the biggest reason the Titanic was lost? Was it excessive confidence, the lack of lifeboats, the decision to maintain speed through an ice field, failures in communication, or simply an unavoidable tragedy? Share your thoughts respectfully in the comments. We genuinely love to hear your perspective. And if there's another historical event or historical figure you'd like us to explore, let us know below. Your suggestion may become our next documentary. If you enjoyed this journey through history, consider subscribing to the Retro Review, where we revisit the moments that changed the world, not to tell you what to believe, but to understand what happened and let history start the conversation. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next chapter of history.